Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. When Jill and I first talked about having this event, we thought it might be a nice filler in that dead period in the run-up to when negotiations started. And when the election was called, we stuck to our view that it would be a nice filler for that dead period in between the predictable election and the start of negotiations. So we, like I think everyone else, hadn't expected what has happened, but in a sense I think this makes this discussion all the more timely, because we can sit here and share our ignorance with you, and you can share yours back with us about the state of British politics and of Brexit. We've got a fantastic panel. On my far right, Jill Rutter of the Institute for Government, Tim Bale of Queen Mary University of London, Helen Drake of the University of Loughborough, and Tom McTague of Politico, based here in London. And the format will be that for the first half hour or so, I'm going to pose them questions and try and get answers out of them. And for the second half hour, we'll take questions from the audience. If during the first half hour there's something burning that relates to something you hear, stick your hand up and we'll try and do it. I'd like this to be relatively fast-paced. I don't want long questions or answers, so we can get as much packed in as we can within the hour. So let us kick us off with a nice easy one. Tim, how long has the Prime Minister got?
I think I've got almost everything wrong about British politics for the last 6 weeks, so don't trust anything I say. I mean, look, she's made it through the weekend, which given some of the stuff that some people were saying Friday, was not, I think, for sure. What I do know, however, what the last 6 weeks has taught me, is not to assume that what we think we know today is going to be true tomorrow. So I think it is clear that the Conservative Party cannot be led into the next election by Theresa May. I think that's the obvious. So the next question is, well, when will that election be? Now, if the Conservative Party thinks it can put that election off indefinitely, then maybe she hangs on longer than most people imagine. If the Conservative Party suspects that that election will occur sooner rather than later, I think it's going to need to make the decision to replace Theresa May sooner rather than later. And I think that means it's a matter of weeks, probably months. I'm not sure that a coalition as potentially unstable as this legislative coalition will be, and I'm not talking about an executive coalition, I'm just talking about a minority government with DUP support. I don't think it's that stable. So if I were the Conservative Party, I would be thinking about making a change fairly soon.
With a view to an election fairly soon? With
a view to an election fairly soon. Now, I understand why the Conservative Party don't want an election soon, because...
Wait, no one?
No. Well, that's one reason that no one wants an election fairly soon. The other reason is because they're afraid they might lose it to Labour, and of course they've got all sorts of other things on their mind. On the other hand, at least one thing that they will be thinking is they want to control the situation. And better to elect a leader with a timetable for an election in the back of their minds than see everything spin out of control, be forced into an election, and before they're really ready for it.
Brilliant, thank you. Tom, just to, let me just say before I ask Tom this question that he wrote the best quick analysis, I mean, of the election, but also of the referendum campaign. Long before Shipman's proofs had arrived on his desk, Tom had written a brilliant, detailed analysis of the referendum campaigns that if you haven't read, I recommend to you. But on the here and now, how do you think this new parliamentary arithmetic affects Brexit, the odds of soft versus hard, and so on?
I don't even think the ministers know that at the moment. I think they're really trying to come to terms with what's happened, try to understand it. They don't understand what's just happened. I just spoke to one, I bumped into him on the way up on Whitehall, and he just said, well, it's raw politics now. That's what it is. It's compromise, it's deal making with whoever it is you need to do a deal with to get that thing immediately in front of you through Parliament. So I think the first thing is that it completely disempowers Theresa May. I mean, you saw that at the weekend in the interviews on Mar. I mean, it was quite extraordinary to watch Michael Fallon just essentially say that he and other cabinet ministers went in and told her, you can't carry on like you have been, that's an order. You know, it was amazing. So it completely disempowers Theresa May, and it empowers the cabinet, I think, above all. You know, they now decide when she goes, how long she lasts for, and then that's a personal interest for them. I think David Davis and Boris Johnson are the biggest powers now in cabinet, because they have a backing in the parliamentary party. So that's the most important thing to gauge the power of the cabinet minister, I think, how much sway they have in the Tory party in Parliament. It empowers Ruth Davidson, obviously, and I think just broadly it empowers Parliament, you know, because the Conservative backbenchers at the moment are quite powerful, but if there is a deal with Labour, then that disempowers them as well to a certain extent. So I think it's the cabinet that is all powerful at the moment, and then just politics in the raw.
But can I push you a little bit and ask whether you think, I mean, would you at least be willing to say that a soft Brexit is now more likely than it was before the election?
Well, I think she has to compromise. So she can't have her Brexit or Nick Timothy's Brexit, because she expected to get through this and then say, look, I have my mandate, you have no say. She hasn't got that. She hasn't got Nick Timothy. She hasn't got Fiona. She's got a guy who's an MP that's a former MP. He's just lost his seat. And you could tell how weak she was actually by her appointment of Damien Green as First Secretary. You know, that's her only friend in politics, her long-term friend, his university friend. So he's there now as the only person she trusts on a personal level. So, you know, he's going to be her shield. So I think if Parliament and politics is the winner, then that means compromise is the winner. So I don't know whether that's how soft you can get, because ultimately, I just had a text from a friend. I was frantically asking what this means to him earlier, and he said she will be killed if she gives way on immigration. So I mean, that's still fundamentally, you haven't answered that question between immigration and the economy. So if she decides to ditch immigration and go for the economy, she'll get killed from her own backbenchers, and she's on her ear. Boris won't let her do that. David Davis won't let her do that. You've just had Steve Baker appointed to the Brexit department, who's the most hardcore Brexiteer of the lot of them, with his own WhatsApp group of 60 MPs that he texts and sort of as a whipping operation. So, you know, I don't think we can automatically yet say that it's towards a soft Brexit, just that there's going to be a compromise.
So, Jill, I know the IFT have done loads of really good work on the Brexit process up to now. How does this politics interact with that process, do you think? How much harder has this become for the civil service to deliver Brexit for us?
I think it makes it what was already a massively difficult task hugely more difficult, because if you think what we're about to do. So what would I have been saying if we'd got the sort of expected mandate back? I would have said there were basically three big tasks that were about to kick off. The first was negotiating. One of the problems now is there are some things that we could negotiate about. We can talk about citizens' rights, we can start some talks about the money, we can start to explore options for Ireland, but actually at the moment, just as Tom was saying, we don't really know what we're aiming for, at least before we had some of those sort of red lines clearly in place, so that makes the negotiations a whole bunch more complicated. Getting legislation through with a minority, any of those of us, I was in number 10 when John Major was managing through, Alex Allen in the audience was his principal private secretary. It's enormously draining on the centre of the operation. It depends on having really good business managers. Always wondering whether you can get the votes is really, really difficult. And that's just the Commons. That's before you get into the sort of set of issues in the Lords. And I think their task there has been made harder by the decision of George Bridges to leave the Brexit department. George was quite widely respected, very much liked in the Lords. He would have actually probably had the best chance of managing that through the Lords, so the task of getting the legislation is much harder. And the third thing that you need is we are now on this countdown to 2019 when we need to be ready for the possibility that we leave with no deal, which means we need some of those processes that we need to have in place against that possibility being implemented. And that starts to need decisions. It needs decisions on what sort of customs system we're going to implement, because people need to start actually doing things on the ground to get ready. And what's very unclear is how easy it will be to make any of those decisions. So I think you've just sort of cubed the level of difficulty by the current political position.
Thank you. And finally, Helen. Helen, I should say, is running a big ESRC project on the other member states and Brexit, because I think we sometimes forget that there are other people involved in this negotiation as well. Looked at from the other side of the channel, Helen, whether it be Brussels or the various capitals, A, what has the reaction been, and B, is there a sense that this changes anything?
Thanks. Let me start by saying that one of the great absentees of the referendum was the idea that there were 28 plus perspectives on Brexit. I think it was Simon Cooper in the FT who wrote that living in the UK is like living in a glass house. Everyone can see in, but we can't really see out, and when we do see out, we don't really understand what people are saying. He was making a point about monoglot Britain and so on and so forth. So it is important to understand. And now I'm going to talk the language of negotiation. So, I mean, first of all, Brexit is ultimately a bilateral negotiation between the European Union on the one hand and the UK on the other, bilateral. So whatever the 27 member states are saying and thinking and feeling, according to Michel Barnier, who talked about passion and so on, political passion, whatever they're saying, ultimately they will aggregate into one EU position. I mean, I'm simplifying slightly. And so we know that Barnier for the Commission has talked since the election about truth. I thought that was quite French and philosophical, how Brexit needs to be about truth and explaining the truth. Donald Tusk has been quite theatrical as well, hasn't he, in his responses. So we've got an idea of the aggregate position. And I think that's my first point, really. But Brexit's not only bilateral, it's multi-party. I said I was going to talk the language of negotiations, and what that means. So it does matter what the EU 27 and the main parties are the national government. So it does matter what they think and what they feel and what they say, because in pre-talk stage, and we're a year, is it, since the referendum? 3 months since Article 50. God, is that a whole year of my life? Anyway, we're a year on and we're in pre-talks. And in pre-talk, before negotiations start for proper, this is when the parties, principally the national government, seek to make relationships. And negotiations are fundamentally about relationships. So whether we talk about the Franco-German relationship or others and so on. And what the 27 are saying, and we could go through that afterwards, perhaps in the question and answer, rather than, I'm not going to go through all 27 now, it's easy enough to find out, but it does matter, that's my point, because they're parties to the negotiation in their own right. And I think, just to sort of complete that point, Britain, the UK government, is also, from this multi-party perspective, it's a primary party to the negotiation, and I think it's hard to see how the election has done nothing other than weaken the the UK as a party in its own right, because negotiation parties have to function. You know, they have to be able to decide, they have to be able to communicate, and they have to be able to own the problem or own the opportunity. And they also have to work with sort of supporting parties and mediators, including the press, who have their own agenda. So all of that kind of internal strife or internal aggregation to the UK as a party to the negotiations has probably got a bit tougher. And so as a bilateral and multi-party negotiation, the EU 27 are looking in with some perplexity, I would say.
They're not the only ones. So, I mean, I suppose the next question is for Tim and Tom, whichever wants to take it. I mean, Jill mentioned Maastricht, and one of the things I wonder about these negotiations is it going to feel a bit like John Major at Maastricht, who was on the phone to Michael Howard every 30 seconds to check that he could get away with what he just negotiated or whether he'd be brought down by his cabinet. So are we going to see a year of Theresa May with Philip Hammond on her left ear and David Davis on her right ear, checking that she can triangulate properly, or do you think the cabinet will try and come together and remain relatively cohesive through this? And then, of course, behind the cabinet, there's the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Is it possible to come up with a negotiating position?
Well, I don't know what Tom thinks. I mean, I suspect the cabinet at the moment is probably less of a problem than the party more generally, although I take Tom's point that obviously there are people within the cabinet who are thinking about their own position and possibly taking over from Theresa May, which complicates things. But I do think it's the parliamentary party that is the real problem. You know, Tom mentioned Steve Baker and his WhatsApp group. I mean, it's very, very difficult to imagine up to, I think, 80 Conservative MPs being willing to do any kind of compromise on this, and they are the sort of people who will threaten and possibly will actually pull the pin on a hand grenade if they feel that she is letting them down or betraying them in any way. And I think the idea that somehow she can avoid that problem by doing some sort of deal with the Labour Party is a fantasy, to be honest. I don't think it's in Labour's interest to be seen to be doing a deal with the Conservatives in the run-up to what they assume will be an election reasonably soon. And also I don't think Labour really want to do a deal that reveals its own hand on Brexit, because at the moment Labour's vagueness in some senses helps it electorally, because it allows them to persuade people who don't like immigration that they're against freedom of movement, but it allows them also to argue with supporters who are more pro-European that they want to be or get the benefits of the single market. Any kind of deal, and it can't be done in secret, it will be too obvious, will actually reveal what Labour's position is. So I don't think that's an alternative. So she will have to be looking over her shoulder and will have to make sure that she keeps those Eurosceptics on board, and that's why I don't think actually a softer Brexit is necessarily any more likely because of what's happened.
So we're almost back to sort of John Major versus John Smith, because of course the Labour Party's policy under John Smith on Europe was to give away as little as possible and attack the government all the time. And it sounds to me like that's what you're saying, the Labour Party. Does the Labour Party have a position on Brexit?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, a colleague of mine went up to Stoke for the Stoke by-election, and they had leaflets that ate UKIP's leaflets with, you know, the St George's Cross and "We will tackle immigration, we will enforce Brexit," and then that's the same party, you know, campaigning in Islington and elsewhere. It's, you know, it's untenable. Well, no, potentially it is tenable if they don't have to make a decision on it. So I don't think they have a clear position on that. I also thought there was Britain's obvious weakness causes us a little bit of a problem in Brussels as well, you know, because they are obviously stronger, but Theresa May potentially is the best they're going to get as far as they can see. You know, I'm amazed every time I go and see my colleagues in Brussels. That's where we have our headquarters. How much vitriol there is for Boris Johnson is incredible. They despise the man, but they also hate David Davis. So they're the two front runners. They think David Davis is stupid, and they think Boris Johnson is a clown, and they can't get past that. So the thought of those two, one of those two taking over, is awful for them. But also the other thing that they hate in Brussels is populism. You know, this is the sort of catchword that they talk about all the time. And Jeremy Corbyn is essentially a populist. So, you know, where do they turn if they haven't got Theresa May? So I think they will be wary not to bring down the government too quickly with some, you know, huge demand, whether it's on money or migration. I think the messages I'm getting, they want to seem reasonable. They're not going to change their positions on the four freedoms, but they want to appear reasonable, and they don't want to be seen to be punishing the UK. So
this is classic Robert Putnam, isn't it? If you're weak at home, you might be strong abroad because everyone treats you with kid gloves for fear that it's going to lead to a collapse. So let me ask you one question. So I spent the first 50 years of my life taking no interest in British politics because I thought it was boring, and now I suddenly realise I need to gen up on it. But have we ever had an election where so many of the candidates from the main opposition party ran on their own manifestos effectively? That, you know, you see on Twitter now all these Labour MPs saying, actually I ran on a platform of being in the single market. You think, well, actually you had a manifesto. I mean, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, it does make it very awkward for the Labour Party to assume a position that's credible, really. I mean, we have Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell for sure.
Never say for sure.
Okay. Who look like they're quite happy with a relatively hard Brexit, in the sense of relatively hard Brexit, with a Brexit that actually involves us leaving the single market while somehow preserving the benefits of it, because, you know, they want to control freedom of movement. But you have, I would say, 95% of Labour MPs who wish we weren't leaving at all, and certainly don't want to leave on that basis, even though they voted for Article 50. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult for Theresa May, I think, to sort of get buy-in from her party to whatever she agrees to. It'll be just as difficult, I think, for Corbyn and McDonnell. Now, I know they're seen by many people as kind of the winners of this election. I'm not sure so many Labour MPs believe that, and I'm not sure all their problems are over with the PLP.
How quickly does the Labour Party need an election before it starts to look like the parliamentary Labour Party of before the election?
I think that partly depends on Jeremy Corbyn, actually. I mean, I think if Jeremy, I mean, Tom would be interested to talk to on this. I think if Jeremy Corbyn actually compromises with the non-Corbynites and does actually accept the offer of some people now to serve under him, that could make a difference. I think if he, takes the Paul Mason line of sort of, sticking with all the people he's got and getting rid of the people who criticised him, that's not going to work. But if he brings in people like Chukwuemeka, if he brings in people like Yvette Cooper, and he shows actually he is prepared to compromise, that could really help, I think.
Do you want to?
He didn't compromise beforehand when he looked like he was going to lose, by 20 points, and he's just done something remarkable. So I can't see why he would compromise. He'll bring them back as a show, I'm sure, but he has a legitimate argument to say, no, you compromise to my point of view.
The only thing I would say about Jeremy Corbyn, and without going too far back into the election, is that he did change over the course of the last few months. I mean, if you remember Jeremy Corbyn's media performances at the beginning, he didn't like being asked questions, he walked away from journalists, he was grumpy, and then by the end of it, he's sitting on the sofa, Monsieur Zen, laughing. I mean, he is capable of learning and change, although the image of him, the stereotype of him is that he's stuck in the 1970s. I do wonder, actually, whether he might be a little bit more flexible.
He loves campaigning, though.
Yeah, that's true.
When you speak to his inner circle, they just say that he just loves it. He loves getting out. He hates Westminster. He hates the job of being leader of the opposition. He loves campaigning to be Prime Minister. They're two different things. So how will he react to...
Unless he sees this now, and come back to Anand's question, as a sort of permanent campaign over the next few months, in other words. So he sees bringing those people in as part of a successful campaign. I mean, I take your sceptical, point of view.
Just to move on a little bit, Jill, one of the things about Brexit is it involves this horrendous legislative programme.
Yeah.
One of the things I don't understand about Jeremy Corbyn's position is what his position on the Great Repeal Bill is, because he doesn't seem to like it, but it seems to me the one obvious thing you have to do if you're leaving the European Union. So I suppose two questions. One, can you throw any light on that? And if not, don't worry. And B, what prospect for the legislation that we're going to need in the autumn?
I think it's really interesting because the Labour manifesto said we will drop the government's Great Repeal Bill, which, if you believe in leaving the single market and things like that, actually isn't an option. And we will rename it the Protection of Employment and Environmental Rights Bill or something like that. So there was a sort of renaming of it. But actually, if you take the government at face value, that is exactly what the Great Repeal Bill does. And one of the things I thought was really interesting before the election was the extent to which the sort of, the people who may be in the longer term the advocates of Singapore on the Thames were actually saying, no, we accept that this is not the moment to repeal all the bits of the acquis that we've hated for years. We accept that as an interim stage to leaving, we have to put that into the UK statute book. That's what we're going to do in the Great Repeal Bill. Then we can start the debates about, which bits do we want to get rid of and things like that. So I think actually the really interesting thing is, can the government do enough to make the case that whatever you think is going to happen, it is an act of folly and irresponsibility to block the Great Repeal Bill, because all you do, and I think the government needs to do more in terms of getting other external advocates saying this will cost jobs, this will cost business and stuff like that. We actually need to be guaranteeing that whatever happens, there will not be that legal hiatus, which there would be if we fail to get the Great Repeal Bill and then all this secondary legislation through. I think the government also needs to make good on some of the sort of language David Davis was expressing when he thought he would probably have a thumping majority before the election about a partnership with Parliament. So actually, can we have better processes to say these are the bits that matter, these aren't the bits that matter, these genuinely are just technical changes. So I think it's really interesting that does government make good on any of that? Is government a bit more transparent with Parliament than it has been to date? Because so far the strategy has been minimal information produced under maximum duress, extremely grudgingly. And we've had a sort of Prime Ministerial reboot a bit over the weekend before the 1922 committee. So does that carry over to the attitude of government towards Parliament on Brexit?
And the whole row about names is ridiculous anyway, because parliamentary convention means it's going to have a dull name as a bill anyway.
It will not be called the Great Repeal Bill. It will not be called the Great Repeal Bill. It will be called, some extraordinarily, the translation of whatever. And you actually want it called something really boring and dull because you don't want to open up your way for loads and loads of amendments, because you don't want a field day for everybody who wants to impose their version of Brexit to amend that bill to do that.
So Helen, very straightforward question for you then. If it transpired that we changed our minds at some point in this process for whatever reason, is there unanimity in the European Council to let us stay if that's what's required?
I was just thinking, yes. My preface was that I was sitting here kind of mesmerised. You said British politics has just got interesting. Well, it's mesmerising. It's sort of like on a loop, isn't it? And so I was just getting a bit carried away with that. But I think that, and then I thought, I feel like I'm about to commit a heresy, which is to say, is partly for the reasons I gave and the nature of negotiations, it is quite hard to see how Brexit negotiations will succeed. So, for example, at this, I don't mean that they can't, I'm a scholar of the EU, so I know how these things work and everything is possible, but at this stage in proceedings, what the UK is supposed to be doing is building coalitions internally. Jill, you mentioned other stakeholders, advocates, I think you called them, but also coalitions outside, overcoming obstacles and so on. What the UK shouldn't really be doing right now is discussing strategy or doing strategy, but we don't even have a strategy. So that's sort of one set of comments. But you asked, is there unanimity? Well, if we listen to what the member states are saying, there is unanimity that the UK cannot stay, right? So the answer would appear to be that there is no way for us to get back in. But I think what member states say, to their media, to their partners and so on and so forth, and what they'll actually end up, what the positions that they'll actually end up in are slightly different. So it's not surprising that, sort of people like my 91-year-old mum, she says, oh, why are they being so beastly to us? Well, it's not surprising, given that the UK has asked to leave, that this is being said and that there are sort of tough messages coming back. But those are messages for consumption by all sorts of different audiences. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the UK can't stay and that there won't be an agreement for us to stay.
So amongst those 27 heads of state and government, there isn't one who looks round at, the new Franco-German partnership that seems to be building, at the fact that the Eurozone might be growing a little bit now, at all this talk about defence integration and the fact that, things are finally, as they say, getting better, and thinks actually, we don't want them back blocking every single thing we try and do in the future. Why should I vote for that?
You're right, yeah.
I'm not saying they should say that.
I remember sort of very soon after the referendum being asked by French students whether, who were quite excited at the idea that there would finally be a Europe of defence and so on and so forth. And my argument then was that there has to be agency, there has to be leadership. Somebody in the EU, a member state, has to pick that up and run with it. So you're right, at the moment there's sort of some manoeuvring and language about doing more together, and we have Macron and so on. But I suppose in the same way as you could conceptualise Brexit as a hostile act vis-à-vis the other 27, for the 27 or any of them to say, well, no, you can't come back in, would also be a kind of a slightly hostile act against allies. So who knows?
Brilliant. That's the half-hour mark. So. Oh, there is a microphone. Happily.
So Paul McDermott from Charles and Hamlins. With the government immigration versus the economy parliamentary party at war, Labour, if they're sensible, will just exploit and stand back from that tension. Everybody seems to be geared up for an election. Is this not just a transitional deal that's going to be kicked into the long grass with the Brexit timetable of March 2019?
We're going to take a few questions there. So I'm not ignoring people, I'm going for geographical proximity with the mic, that's all.
Or you need a woman, yes. It's John Peet from The Economist. Since I'm from The Economist, I also wanted to ask about the economy, and particularly the position of Philip Hammond and the Treasury, which seems to be stronger today than it was before the election, and business, I think my question is really for Tom, but maybe for others, business also seems to be starting to speak out on Brexit more than they were before. Is that constellation going to make a difference? And go back to the question, put the economy as the more important issue than migration?
Who wants to have a first stab at one of those two? Tom, do you want to?
Did you mean the transitional arrangement as in leaving the... I think that seems sensible. Yeah, if we can't agree on what our strategy is or what we want, then I think George Osborne was saying that where he thinks we'll get to is just a very, very long-term transitional arrangement, perhaps in the EEA or something like that. But I think that comes with freedom of movement. So I think that is problematic in itself. But as a transitional arrangement, I think, a permanent transition, I think, is probably where we're heading to. That's what some people think. On Hammond, I think that's absolutely right. Hammond is undeniably far stronger than he was before. I mean, Number 10 were appalling in their, treatment of Hammond. There was briefing that he was going to go. They were briefing against his team. They were briefing against his budget, even though they'd signed it off. That was, I think we saw, the way that they U-turned on the budget was exactly the same way they U-turned on the manifesto. So we know now that was a number 10 operation, and Hammond was forced to take the blame. So he was furious. And rightly so. And he is strengthened. I think from people I speak to in business, they're saying that what they now have is they have lobbying abilities. They can focus on a group of 10 people, and go after them, pro business Tories, the Scottish Tories, Ruth Davidson, whoever it is, and go and lobby them in the same way they did over the national insurance rise. If you think of that as a small example of what is now going to happen on an issue by issue basis, where you just need 10-15 people to bring down the government.
But on this permanent transition, if I can just take you up on that, I mean, going back to Tim and Steve Baker's WhatsApp group, they won't let that through.
No, I mean, so this is the problem that we haven't resolved, have we? This is. I don't see. I mean, Steve Baker won't be allowed to run his WhatsApp group now, so I don't know who will take over as the. There were three. I did once see it. I was shown it in a restaurant. There were about 3 group admins on the WhatsApp. So we'll have to find out who they are, and they will be the target of intense lobbying. No, I can't see how they let that through at all.
Bernard Jenkins knows how to use WhatsApp.
I think he is on there.
Yeah, he's on there. I wonder whether he.
I mean, I think it's transition, isn't it? If you're they were prepared to accept compromise if they were getting to a destination. That's what they always said to me, that if the destination was out and control of migration all the rest, they could stomach compromise on migration for that period. So whether they'll now say we are just inevitably weaker so we can accept a longer compromise, I don't even think they've figured that out yet.
Can I just come back on John's question? I mean, moving it away from the Treasury and business and lobbying, I mean, I think the economy is going to be incredibly important over the next 2 years. And I mean, the news today is all about the DUP and Theresa May, but the second item on the news is about 2.9% inflation, economy perhaps beginning to slow down, consumer confidence, etc., etc. These negotiations, such as they are in this parliamentary situation, such as it is, at the moment is being conducted against a relatively benign economic past. The future doesn't look that good, and in terms of public opinion, I do think actually that the economy will make a difference. And I'm not saying it will turn so badly that public opinion moves against Brexit, but we are kind of assuming, because so far people think that it's a done deal, it's inevitable, it's going to happen, that the levels of satisfaction with that route will stay the same, and I'm not sure that they will if the economy turns down.
I mean, just to come in on that, I mean, one of the things that has conditioned the debate was that the Treasury's apocalypse now on June 24th didn't happen, but apocalypse delayed potentially. So I think the economy starting to change the thing. The other thing is whether migration stays as such a top of mind issue. I mean, the latest migration figures that came out that showed that very substantial, reining back the EU big change in EU net migration, I think becomes interesting. The figures today about nurse recruitment, that falling off a cliff of nurse recruitment, I think it's really interesting whether the migration debate we've been used to stays the same or whether actually a lot of the heat goes out. And the Eurozone growth also means that the sort of pull-push changes dramatically.
Yeah, and of course, if the economy goes anywhere near recession, then that will be a solution to the migration problem, because of course migration will go down.
So rejoice, no one wants to live here anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks. My first John Henry from The Guardian. So my first question was pretty much more or less answered. I was going to ask about the Norway. Well, the one I was planning when I stuck my hand up was about the Norway option, which I think has been pretty much answered. But so my sort of follow-up would be, if assuming that the Article 50 negotiations do start at some stage within the next, whenever, has the result of the election changed in any way what are likely to be the main stumbling blocks in those talks? Which of the 3 or 4 key components of the Article 50 talks might be influenced by the outcome of the election?
And the gentleman straight behind you.
Bill Wells. I dealt with Europe for 3 decades or whatever. I was wondering about the negotiating position of the 27 and how that relates to the Great Repeal Act. Because if, as Jill says, essentially you get the single market de facto into UK law, and that breaks the link with migration, what will the EU do? Will they say, we're going to change our acquis so you can't keep the de facto single market?
Sorry,
Helen.
I just drifted. What was it? Could you the last bit about that?
If they accept the Great Repeal Bill, so essentially it becomes the single market in UK law, how can the Commission and the European Union, with any legitimacy, say, sorry, you signed up to the single market, but you can't sign up to the single market?
Do you want me to?
I'll look at the first one if you want.
Yeah, I mean...
Okay, no, I'll say something.
Okay.
On the stumbling blocks question, that is true. I've been thinking about this recently. I think because we thought we'd agreed the migration controls over the economy. That was we were going to take migration control was going to take priority. So that was a question answered, or we thought, and now that's been unanswered, and we don't know where we are on that. So, but I think on the other side of the coin, we had the ECJ and the Customs Union seemed to be real red lines that we couldn't compromise on. And now it seems like they are a little bit fuzzy. So I think there does appear to be some movement on Customs Union particularly, which might solve Northern Ireland.
But I'm not sure it totally solves Northern Ireland, but it sort of makes it easier. But I think one of the effects of having this arrangement with the DUP, and the DUP manifesto is very interesting on Brexit, is that the DUP have none of the language about no deal is better than a bad deal. The DUP is all about deals, and that's the deal to solve the Ireland set of issues. They actually also give more prominence to the economy, actually interesting, because I don't think migration is quite the potent issue in the north of Ireland that it is in England, so, which is what the issue is really. So I think it's quite interesting. I think Ireland will become much more potent. We had an event here in April where somebody said basically the UK was allowing the Commission to make the running on Ireland because of the pressure from the Irish government. I think that's going to change because I think we will have to be paying quite a lot of attention to that. I think on Bill's point, the thing about the acquis is anyone can mimic the EU's set of regulations, that's fine, but The single market is a lot more than that. The single market is about contributing, it's about accepting the full freedoms, whatever, which includes freedom of movement at the moment. Maybe that can be reformed, sort of Barry Gardner away, but maybe maybe not. So, I mean, you know, it's much more of a sort of package than just accepting the acquis. And there is one issue, which is we can be equivalent on day one, but if you're Europe, you want to know, are we equivalent going forward? And are we prepared to stay aligning and to stay accepting ECJ jurisdictions? And those are some of the issues. I mean, so it's really interesting. Most free trade agreements are about trying to converge. This is actually about finding a way of managing divergence in sort of areas. So it's a very different sort of process.
I have to say, I think the ECJ is the answer to both questions. The ECJ is the answer on the acquis, and the ECJ and citizens' rights is the answer to Article 50, because the EU is going to have to change its position, it seems to me, or we won't be able to accept it. But, come on, Helen, do you want to?
No, I mean, I suppose I keep sort of finding myself at the same point, which is the UK does have a lot of cards as a negotiating party. All it has to try and do is to play those to play those cards in the right order. So I'm glad you were listening. It's about overcoming obstacles and so on. And I mean, only once discussions start and the UK starts playing its hand and it starts being a full negotiating party will we know what the concessions can be on the other side. For now, it's like students who just do drafts and drafts and drafts of essays and never actually write the essay. It's hard to know how to respond to it and what feedback to give. So until things start, I mean, that's my line really, that there is a lot to play for, and that the negotiations are by definition, they're dynamic and they're interacting variables, and those will change daily. So nothing is really set in stone, despite the positions that have been set out. So that's sort of an answer.
The Danish ambassador just next to the camera.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm the Danish ambassador. Just a comment on the issue of coming back as a member. I think Article 50 is quite clear on that issue. I mean, as long as we have not terminated the negotiations on the divorce bill, the UK is a full member of the European Union in its own right as today. So if the UK withdraws the notification before the end of the Article 50 negotiations, I assume that they will stay as a member as they are today. But it depends on UK's own decisions. If we have an agreement on the divorce settlement within the 2-year deadline, then Article 50 is very clear. You have to reapply as a normal candidate country, and then you will have to assume there will be no rebate on the budget. You will have to be a member of the euro and whatever. So that's a different situation. But while you're sitting here talking, like they are also sitting in other places in Whitehall talking. I mean, we are actually waiting for you to come to the negotiating table in Brussels on Article 50. The 2-year deadline is on the divorce settlement, not on the future. That's a different issue. So, therefore, my question is, I mean, the clock is ticking. And the more you spend time here talking to yourself in the UK, the less likely it is that we will have a good deal by the end of the 2-year deadline. So is no deal is better than a bad deal? Is that taken off the table after the election? That's my question.
Which one of you wants to answer that question? Is no deal still better than a bad deal?
I'm not sure that was ever more than rhetoric, to be honestly. I mean, it disappeared for a while and then suddenly made a reappearance in the Conservative manifesto, which I was a little bit surprised about. I thought Theresa May had backed off that. I mean, I just think it's very hard to think of any serious economist or diplomat or anyone who thinks that outside of the WhatsApp group again, to give them that name. I mean, that's my view anyway.
Alan, who's in the same, if you could just pass the microphone down.
But Alan, there are two sorts of no deal, aren't there?
Oh, okay.
One of which is no deal because you've had a deal and you've decided it's unacceptable. The other one is it's just too chaotic to get, because the clock is ticking, we've lost a bit of time now. We potentially lose more time than we expected. You expected to lose the election period, but the government expected to come back and sort of be reinvigorated and able to make process. It's now going to be bogged down in lots of things, internal processes. So I think you could say that the risk of a chosen no deal has gone down, but at the same time the risk of a sort of disorganised no deal and sort of accidental no deal has possibly gone up, unless at some point both sides agree that this is not a great option and there's a mutual agreement to extend the Article 50 deadline.
There's more than one thing to make a deal on as well, though. There could be lots of deals, but no deal on the big overarching future trade negotiation or even agreement to get to that point. But you could have an agreement on the open skies deal, whatever that is, that keeps us flying between America and Europe and all of those things. My understanding is you can do deals on that to make sure it's not complete chaos, but still be very bad.
But it needs to be signed and approved.
That's reassuring.
But there are lots of things, though, aren't there? It's not all, it doesn't have to all be in one giant.
No, not necessarily, but you still need approval by the European. Yeah, okay.
Alan Rennick from the UCL Constitution Unit. This relates very much to what you've just been discussing, but I was just a bit surprised by the idea that Steve Baker and his WhatsApp group are all powerful here, because if at the end of the 2-year period we get to a stage where the choice is either either no deal or a deal only on the divorce terms, so no deal on the full future relationship, or a transition arrangement of some kind, then surely a government that attempted no deal would lose a vote of confidence in this Parliament.
Well, a government that turned down a transition?
Yeah, a government that attempted to go for the no deal option. I mean, if the alternatives in March 2019 are either basically no deal on many things that are really important, or going into some kind of transition arrangement, it seems to me that a government that attempted to go for the first of those rather than the second would lose a vote of confidence in this Parliament.
Can we have one answer from someone?
That does seem to be true. Although, but the government is also the government almost chosen by the Conservative Party. So they have to, if they got to a stage where they were trying to force through a deal through Parliament that was unacceptable to the Conservative Party but acceptable to Parliament, would the government be able to get to that point before it was brought down by the backbenchers in the Conservative Party? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, long term, as we know from the 1970s even, it's not a great idea for a Conservative government to rely on Labour votes to get a piece of European legislation through, because 30, 40 years later it will come back to bite you.
Which raises an interesting question, doesn't it? Because if she gets a deal, and if she thinks she's going to lose the vote in Parliament, and if she knows that losing the vote in Parliament will be the end of her career, why doesn't she just manufacture a breakdown in the talks? I mean, anyway, gentlemen.
Alex Allen. Not sure it's on. Alex Allen, a former civil servant. I want to ask, does the Labour Party really need a policy on Brexit? In the sense, isn't it perfectly possible for it simply to oppose anything that the government says or does? And I mean, in some ways, isn't that the lesson of the 1990s, when the Labour Party simply voted against the government on every opportunity and without necessarily having a coherent policy? So I wonder whether you think the Labour Party needs to paper over all its internal cracks and can't just unite on opposing the government.
Anyone?
Exactly. Jeremy Corbyn came to power, if you remember, in the Labour Party when he was the only one who opposed the welfare deal that Harriet Harman had signed up to. And so that sort of got a lot of support in the party. All the rest of them, I think, backed it as a compromise immediately after the 2015 election, as a sort of lessons learned, we need to tackle welfare. And you could draw the lesson that you've drawn, oppose, that's all you have to do.
The only difference, I suppose, is that when John Smith started doing something similar on Maastricht, he could rely just about then on the Conservative Party surviving a no confidence motion, which is what Major did, didn't he? Just. That's right. I'm not so sure it would now, because I think there are sufficient people in the Conservative Party who would pull the pin on the government.
Can I just say for the camera, I'm not ignoring loads of women with their hands up to ask questions on purpose. It's just that it's only been men so far. So,
another man, Roger Dore, Better Government Initiative, ex-civil servant. We've had a number of comments and questions on what would the attitude be of Europeans if we decided to change our mind. But just a prior question, does anyone think it's conceivable that we could say, forget it, we'll stay after all?
Does anyone want to say anything's inconceivable ever again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is conceivable, so not inconceivable. I mean, you know, one of the big sort of characters in the whole drama has been the will of the people. So as a negotiating party, the UK government has been is still constrained by this, it's not, but by this character of the will of the people, through the referendum. I suppose as time goes on, that's kind of fragmenting and it's becoming weaker, and some of them would die off, and that's sort of, and
22 months.
But the serious point being that I think it is conceivable because of the dynamics at play, that over time this beast that has been foregrounded, and I say again the will of the people that was constructed through the referendum and sort of carried on a platter by some media and so on, that probably will change. Everything's going to change. So that's I think that would be my evidence.
Tim's point about the economy is absolutely fundamental to that. Anyway, lady with the mic.
Yeah, Fedra van Uysen from the National Audit Office. I was wondering about transparency. So the EU has said they would publish all documents around negotiation on the website. How do you think that will affect the UK's negotiation position and maybe trigger a new election at some point? Thank you.
I think the EU is making sort of virtue out of necessity, because if it didn't publish everything, it would all leak anyway. Everybody's always said Brussels is as leaky as a sieve, and they also learnt their lesson from one or two trade deals they did, agreements they did, where they ended up with the Parliament sort of not agreeing, having not been taken along. So that said, we've written about this, that we actually think that the UK ought to be quite transparent too, not least because once it tables any propositions, those will leak as well. So we'll see that. We already saw what happened at a private dinner that Mrs. May had with Monsieur Juncker and Herr Zellmeyer, how that sort of stayed secret for about a day and a half. So we think we ought to make a virtue there and put stuff out and be quite transparent. And partly that is because at the end of this, there will probably be a parliamentary vote. You may need ratification. Government needs to do a much better job than it has done so far of taking Parliament with it, or at least making a show of doing that. And I think on Labour, one of the really interesting questions is whether you could say this really is a major, not exactly existential crisis, but this is a very big issue facing the country. The MP in my constituency ran on a manifesto of having voted against Article 50, doing her best to protect the rights of residents, etc., etc. I think it's really interesting whether there are detachable Labour people who actually will say, I am actually, as the Maastricht people did, I'm going to put country above party on this and actually, go for what makes sense. So I think it's interesting how unified Labour stays on that.
There's a gentleman right in front of I think you're just about getting.
Hi, Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA. On that point, there's only one set of arithmetic that can deliver a parliamentary to vote on this, and that is one that involves the Labour Party. Does the panel think there is any set of circumstances where Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, under his leadership, would walk through the lobby with the Conservatives on it? Secondly, is the idea of a commission the first attempt from the Conservatives to recognise that and say you can't put a fait accompli to Labour? If you're going to get to that point, you need to draw them into the negotiating process and draw them in early. And thirdly, is this now not the time to celebrate a impartial and professional and permanent civil service that's keeping the lights on while politicians are squabbling around looking at who's the next Prime Minister?
Yeah, Helen.
Can I just say something on that last point? I'm really glad you brought it up because, you know, the UK has been a member for 40 plus years and has been an extraordinarily successful member in many respects and has got a lot of expertise and success and wins and so on at having negotiated the sort of things that you were implying that the other member states don't like, you know, the special deals and so on and so forth. So perhaps we shouldn't be so gloomy. You know, that hasn't just dissipated, I assume, and you probably know better than I do, overnight. So there is a context to all this sort of mesmerising squabbling.
The point on both of those, actually, the culture of secrecy in the UK, that may change, I don't know, but you know, with Nick and Fiona before, that was, you know, genuinely people were very scared to talk, they wouldn't give you any details, so, you know, it was that famous dinner with May and Juncker, you know, that was impossible to get anything from this side, you know, other than they wouldn't discuss, you know, what they were even eating, you know, it was a private dinner, you know. I was told you can assume they might have fish, was the most I got. But then we got, you know, endless, you know, information from Brussels, but that has changed now in number 10, so Nick and Fiona have gone. All the other ministers are empowered, so they have relationships with political editors and newspaper editors, so they're going to talk, as are their special advisors. And number 10 itself is gutted. You know, they didn't just lose Nick and Fiona, they lost Lizzie Loudon, who was the press secretary, they lost Katie Perrier, who's the director of communications, so they almost don't have anybody left in there. So somebody said to me that, you know, it is the civil service now that are running the show in number 10. You know, it's back to being Jeremy Hayward, Ollie Robbins. You know, I was told we expect Ollie Robbins in Dexu to do 3/4 of the negotiating. So he would do 3 weeks, and then David Davis would go out for the final week to sort of just, you know, tick the boxes or, you know, smooth out the political problems. Maybe that will be even more pronounced now. I don't know, but I certainly think you'll get much more leaking this out of the UK now.
Can I say on the first thing about Labour and the walking through the lobbies with the tour? I don't know what you think, Tim, but I think, yes, I can imagine that. We get to the end of this process and there's a deal on the table, and your choice is you either vote for it or we crash out without anything at all. That's not a good look to vote against it, I don't think. I mean, obviously, the world can have changed a lot by next week, let alone next autumn. But under those circumstances, I can imagine them doing it, because if the choice was that the flights stop the day after we fall out without a deal, then you're held responsible. That looks bad. Finally.
David Fletcher, is this on? Okay. Do you give any credence to the idea then that follows on from what you've just said of secret talks between Labour and the Conservatives on this? I mean, secret, perhaps a very overused word, but do you think that this is likely to be happening? And if so, what is the significance of that?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say no for the moment. We did a lot of briefings for MPs after the referendum, and we had Remainers on both sides, we had Leavers on both sides, and they would systematically refuse to let us do meetings together for Labour and Conservative. So we had to double it up. And we just said, look, we're talking about the same things, you've got the same concerns, can we not meet in the same room? No. So, yeah. I don't know what you think.
Well, I mean, there'll be cooperation in Parliament to the extent there's the usual channels, etc., but I mean, that probably isn't what you're talking about. I just find that very hard to believe, because it's not consonant with the image that Labour wants to present of itself. Also, I mean, coming back to things that people have already said, how long could you keep that kind of secret? And I don't suspect it will be very long.
But there is an alternative to secret talks, which is quite interesting how many people are now proposing some sort of cross-party commission. We've had it from Yvette Cooper, we've had it from Tim Farron, had it from Nicola Sturgeon, and they clearly need to set up some processes with devolved administrations, if nothing else, because they actually need to agree these common frameworks. There's potentially a huge bust-up, I think, coming in the Great Repeal Bill on the way in which they devolve powers that are being repatriated. And I think it's potentially a really major blockage there. Ruth Davidson has talked about involving more people, going more widely. And on Friday afternoon, I was sort of wondering, you know, if this is a very bizarre thought experiment, but if David Cameron were there, would he actually, looking at the position he'd got, actually have made a sort of, you know, a big open and generous offer and tried to get more hands in the blood and said, okay, you know, this isn't conclusive. You know, is there scope for doing things in a different way, opening this up and involving more voices? This is, after all, about the future of our country, and I invite responsible people who are interested to come and have their say. And I think that would, I think, be better than secret plotting and stuff like that if you were going to do it. I have no idea whether that is anywhere near what anyone would contemplate, but I think it's at least worth throwing into the mix at the present time.
I'm afraid, I mean, I at least could have gone on for hours with this because I think it's fascinating, but we have run out of time.